In a noisy and gloomy Detroit neighborhood, where old brick houses with cracked facades served as reminders of better times, life was harsh. Here the future seemed distant and unattainable, especially for those born into poverty. This was Michael Williams's home, a place where despair became routine and dreams sometimes seemed like unnecessary luxuries. Michael was born in a small two-room apartment where a family of five managed to find a place to sleep, eat, and live. His mother, Rebecca, was a woman of iron will. She worked as a nurse at the local clinic, sometimes moonlighting at night to earn an extra dollar. His father, Henry, was an auto mechanic, a talented craftsman who could revive any engine. But his work rarely brought in a steady income. Michael was the third child, the younger brother of two older sisters, Sarah and Liz. He quickly learned that to survive, you had to fight. Henry often told his children about his childhood of hardship and how important it was to remain resilient in the face of adversity. But those stories came to an abrupt end. When Michael was just 6 years old, his father was killed in a car accident on his way home from work late at night. The tragedy was a turning point. A house that was already struggling to stay on its feet collapsed under the weight of the loss. Rebecca was the sole breadwinner in the family. Her shifts became longer and her conversations with the children shorter. Michael often heard her quiet prayers at night as she asked God for strength and protection for her children. Ever since he was a child, Michael was a dreamer. Unlike many of his peers who resigned themselves to their fate, he imagined a different world. He wanted to get out of Detroit, to escape the endless cycle of poverty. He did not know exactly how to do it, but he felt that knowledge could be his ticket to a better life. His first teacher, Mr. Pearson, was an inspiration to him. He was a kind and considerate man who once told Michael, "Your thoughts can be your most valuable tool. Use them to build your future." These words had captured Michael's heart. At school, he tried his best, spending hours reading in the library to deepen his knowledge. But his efforts were not always appreciated. Some teachers saw him as just another kid from the ghetto, incapable of great accomplishments. "Michael, you might want to focus on practical skills. Maybe become a locksmith or, driver," a school counselor once told him. Those words hurt, but Michael didn't let them get him off track. Every day at home was an ordeal. Rebecca came home from work and barely had time to cook anything. The electricity was often cut off for non-payment, and the neighbors argued so loudly at night that it was impossible to sleep. Michael was used to doing his homework by flashlight, warming himself by the gas stove in the winter when the heat didn't work. Sometimes he worked part-time, delivering newspapers or helping out at the grocery store for a few dollars. He gave the money to his mother, who thanked him, though her eyes were always sad. Michael felt that weight and vowed that someday he would relieve her of her worries. In his 12th year, Michael heard the word university for the first time. It happened when he accidentally stumbled upon a documentary about Harvard. On the screen, young people in smart suits were talking about their ambitions and plans to change the world. Michael looked at them as if they were superhumans, but something inside him whispered, "Why not me?" From that point on, he set a goal. Michael started asking his teachers about what it takes to get into the university, searching for information in the library. He began to realize that education was his only chance for salvation. Not everyone around him supported his aspirations. Some of his friends laughed at him. "Michael, do you really think someone like you can get into college? You better see how to make quick money on the street." Michael had seen his peers go into crime. Some became drug dealers, others simply lost themselves in the chaos of the streets. He knew that if he gave up, he would suffer the same fate. Instead, he found solace in books and dreamed even harder. By the age of 15, Michael already knew he wanted to study finance. He was interested in numbers, systems, and how money worked. He decided he could use this knowledge to not only get out of poverty, but also to help others. Despite the difficulties, he continued to dream. His heart was filled with hope and his mind with plans. This hope, like a dim light at the end of a long tunnel, illuminated his path. Michael realized that the fight was just beginning, but there was a fire in his eyes that couldn't be extinguished. Michael's Hall's school years were a time of discovery, both inspiring and bitter. He learned to love books, to discover the world of math, and to write essays that moved his teachers to tears. But it was also in the school hallways that he first encountered the harsh reality of racism, which, like an invisible barrier, began to stand in his way. When Michael went to middle school, he was already the top student in his class. His grades made him stand out, and his teachers recognized that he was smart. But as time went on, they began to have doubts about him. "You're trying hard, Michael. That's commendable," said Ms. Hudson, his literature teacher. "But you need to be realistic. Harvard? That's too ambitious. I can recommend a community college." Ms. Hudson's words were hurtful, but Michael just nodded, holding back his resentment. He couldn't understand why his classmates with lower grades were told they could be anything they wanted to be, while his dreams were considered unattainable. Gradually, he began to notice that this attitude only applied to black students like him. Michael did not find support among his students either. When he talked about his dreams of becoming a financial analyst or going to a prestigious university, his classmates only laughed. "A financial analyst?" Rick, the boy from the rich family, mocked him loudly. "Do you really think someone like you is going to be a balance sheet analyst? You'd rather be a loader or maybe a janitor in an office." These taunts were heard at every turn. Michael tried to ignore it, but a sense of injustice grew inside him. Why were his aspirations seen as a joke? Why was it so hard for people to see him as a man capable of more? One of the most painful lessons was an incident in math class. Michael loved math and was strong in it. The teacher, Mr. Clark, always assigned difficult problems for the class, but one day when Michael offered his solution, the teacher hesitated. "That's an interesting approach," he said with a note of doubt. "Are you sure you came up with it yourself?" Michael felt a wave of anger surge through his body. He knew for a fact that his classmates, especially the white students, had never been asked such questions. "Yes, I'll do it myself, Mr. Clark," Michael replied, looking straight into his teacher's eyes. "Well, okay," he said, but Michael noticed him writing something down in his notebook. This episode was an eye-opener for Michael. He realized that his successes were questioned not because of lack of knowledge or ability, but because of prejudice. And this was particularly painful for him. One day, Michael was the victim of a direct humiliation. At recess, he was discussing his enrollment plans with a friend when suddenly Tom, a large boy known for his racist views, approached them. "Michael, do you think you're going to be somebody?" he asked mockingly. "You'll always be a step below us. My dad says people like you can only work in a laundry room." Michael felt his fists clench. It was one of those moments when patience fails. He stepped forward and said in a restrained but firm voice, "You know, Tom, someday I'm going to rank higher than you. Not because I'm better, but because I work harder." Tom only laughed, but then pushed Michael in the shoulder. The conflict ended in a fight, which was stopped by the teacher. Michael was punished, even though he was not guilty, and Tom received a warning. This was another lesson in injustice for Michael. When Michael came home bruised, his mother noticed his depressed state. Rebecca, though tired, always made time for her children. She listened to his story and was silent for a long time before she spoke. "Michael, this is the world we live in, and it will challenge you just because of who you are. But know this, you are strong. You can rise above it all. It's up to you to determine who you become." These words of his mother became a source of inspiration for him. He vowed to himself that he would fight for his future, no matter what. Michael began to realize that the color of his skin was not just an external characteristic, but something that affected how people perceived him. This realization was hard, but it tempered his spirit. He worked harder, studying for exams and reading everything he could get his hands on. Although his path was difficult, he realized, to prove his worth, he would have to work twice as hard as the others, and he was ready for it. High school was a time of challenge for Michael, but it was also a time when his desire for success took shape. The realization that he would have to overcome more obstacles than others did not break him, but only strengthened his resolve. For the first time, he felt his dreams begin to take shape and realized that the path to university was more than just a goal. It was his way of proving that his potential could not be limited by stereotypes. Getting into university seemed almost unattainable. His school was not known for its high results, and many teachers didn't even think that any of its students could apply to a prestigious institution. But Michael was determined that he would get in, no matter what it took. He began each morning by repeating the material for the SAT, the standardized test that determined his chances of admission. The school didn't offer preparatory courses, but Michael found old books in the library and used them to study on his own. His friends marveled at his persistence. "Mike, why are you killing time on this?" Jay, his classmate, asked. "Even if you pass the exam, they won't take you anyway." Michael just smiled and kept working. He realized that he couldn't afford the luxury of doubt. One day, when Michael was returning from the library late at night, he found his mother at the kitchen table. She was holding a letter from the bank. It was another refusal to defer the rent. Rebecca noticed his gaze and hid the letter, trying to hide her anxiety. "It's okay, Michael. Don't worry about it." But Michael saw how much she was sacrificing for her family. This moment was another reminder of why he had no right to give up. Later that night, Rebecca walked up to his room holding a stack of papers. "They're scholarship forms," she said. "I found them at work. You have a chance to get help." These questionnaires were a lifesaver. Michael spent hours filling them out, describing his accomplishments, talking about his life, and writing about his dream of making the world a fairer place. Preparing for the exams was hard. The noise in the apartment, the constant absence of light due to debts, and reproaches from his classmates did not make it any easier. One day, a week before the SAT, Michael woke up with a fever. His body felt woozy, but he picked up his books and went to the library. "If I give up now, what will be left of my dream?" he repeated to himself. When the day of the exam came, Michael felt exhausted but confident. He had answered every question, putting in all his energy and knowledge. This was the moment when his efforts were going to pay off. After passing the exams, there was a long waiting period. Michael applied to dozens of universities, but his heart belonged to one place, the University of Michigan. This university was his chance for a good education and the beginning of a new life. The reply letter arrived on a cold February morning. Michael opened the envelope with trembling hands while his mother and sisters watched him. Inside was a short letter, but the most important words were at the beginning. "Congratulations, you have been accepted." "Mom, I did it," Michael whispered before his voice trailed off. Rebecca hugged him, and for the first time in years, he saw her tears of joy. But the child of enrollment was overshadowed by the financial issue. Even with the partial scholarship he received, the tuition fees remained enormous. "We'll figure something out," Rebecca said firmly, but Michael knew that meant more shifts for his mother and more debt. He made a decision: get a part-time job to help support his family. Working nights at the local cafeteria, Michael had time to study during the day. He was tired, but the thought of the future gave him strength. When the day came to move to campus, Michael realized he was taking the first step into a new life. He was saying goodbye to Detroit, but not to the memory of it. All the lessons he had learned from poverty, loss, and injustice had become his source of strength. At first glance, he was just like the other students. But Michael knew that his path to get here was more difficult than most. He wasn't just a freshman, he was a fighter who wouldn't stop until he achieved his goals. Michael Williams walked onto the University of Michigan campus with a sense of pride and anxiety. A life of struggle and hardship was behind him, and a new world of spacious classrooms, green alleys, and endless possibilities lay ahead. But along with the dream of a bright future, Michael faced a new reality: loneliness, which grew worse every day. The campus was crowded with students who seemed to know what they were doing. They were grouped together, discussing their plans and eagerly sharing their experiences. Michael, who was used to having to do everything by himself, felt isolated. When he first walked into the auditorium where the freshmen were being introduced, he noticed his classmates furtively casting glances at him. Their faces seemed friendly, but their gazes concealed distrust. Michael realized that to most of them, he was something of an anomaly. "Are you from Detroit?" one of the girls asked him. Her voice was polite but tinged with curiosity, as if she were talking to someone from another universe. "Yes," Michael replied. "It must be, hard," she said, avoiding his gaze, as if she was afraid to hear something that was out of her perceptions. These conversations quickly taught Michael to avoid unnecessary attention. He tried to say as little about himself as possible, so as not to provoke another barrage of stereotypical questions. At university, Michael was in the minority. Among the hundreds of students in his course, there were only a few who looked like him. It wasn't a surprise to him, but the reality was still painful. In lectures, he was avoided. He tried to join groups for joint projects, but often felt that his presence was received with caution. Some students blatantly ignored his suggestions, while others accepted them but with a note of doubt. In one of the economics classes, the instructor gave an assignment to prepare a group presentation. Michael, as always, suggested the idea and took on most of the work. But on the day of the presentation, his input was almost completely ignored. Everyone was speaking except him. When he did try to take the floor, he was gently but firmly interrupted. After class, he approached one of his classmates to find out why this was the case. "It's nothing personal, Mike," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "It's just that we thought we'd do better if you took care of the technical part." The phrase was another reminder of the invisible wall that separated him from the others. Michael found refuge in what he did best: studying. He spent hours in the library researching topics that went beyond the curriculum. Economics, finance, analytics. These subjects became not only a way for him to prove his worth, but also a source of inspiration. One day, while leafing through a book on game theory, Michael came across a quote that stuck out to him. "Leadership is not something given by society, but something a person takes on." These words became a guiding star for him. Michael realized that, despite his isolation, he could build his own path based on knowledge and perseverance. The first ray of light was the economics teacher, Professor Davis. This strict but fair man noticed Michael's persistence. "Williams, your work is characterized by depth and originality. Are you really interested in the subject, or do you just want to get good grades?" he asked after the lecture. "Both, sir," Michael replied with a slight smile. Since then, Professor Davis has become his mentor. He offered to help Michael with a research project, and that was the first step in Michael being taken seriously. Despite the professor's encouragement, Michael was still alone in the crowd. In the dining hall, he sat at tables alone, watching other students laughing and chatting. In the evenings, the campus came alive with the sounds of parties, but Michael passed by without trying to join the rowdy crowd. One day, he tried to join a circle of economists, hoping to find like-minded people. But his ideas were received with the same distrust as in the classroom. When he proposed a topic for debate, one of the participants laughed outright. "Really? You think you know more than us?" The taunt didn't surprise him, but it still hurt. Michael realized that he had to rely on himself for now. Despite his loneliness, Michael had a dream that gave him the strength to carry on. He believed that knowledge and perseverance would help him succeed. In his free time, he enrolled in additional courses, participated in online conferences, and created his first analytical projects. "I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to learn," he told himself when things got tough. Every night as he fell asleep, Michael imagined the day when his efforts would finally be rewarded. Entering Harvard's graduate program was the pinnacle of Michael Williams's dreams, but also the most difficult decision of his life. This step not only opened the door to a world where he could realize his potential, but also presented him with unprecedented challenges. Lack of funds, exhausting night shifts, and a constant battle with fatigue turned every day into an endless marathon. But Michael knew that giving up was not an option. The letter from Harvard came at the very moment when Michael had almost lost faith. After finishing his undergraduate studies, he had sent applications to several graduate schools, but Harvard was his dream. When he saw the university's coat of arms on the envelope, his heart pounded harder. Inside the letter was the most important line: "We are pleased to announce that you are enrolled in the Master of Arts program in the Department of Economics at Harvard University." Michael stood in his tiny room, feeling tears of joy roll down his cheeks. It was proof that his efforts had not been in vain. But the word didn't last long. Along with the letter came documents outlining the cost of tuition, which was astronomical for someone from his family. "How are we going to afford it?" Rebecca asked, looking at the amounts on the paperwork. "I'll make it happen, Mom," Michael replied. "I'll make it happen." Harvard gave Michael a partial scholarship, but it wasn't enough to cover all his expenses. He took out a student loan that promised to follow him for many years, but even that was not enough. Michael had to find additional sources of income. He studied during the day and worked at night. During his first week in Cambridge, he took a job as a waiter in a 24-hour diner. His shifts lasted until morning, and it was not uncommon for him to return home with sore feet and red eyes. "It's only temporary," he repeated to himself every time his body refused to obey. "I can handle it." Studying at Harvard was much more difficult than he had imagined. Lectures were intense, professors demanded more than he could offer, and assignments consumed all his time. "Mr. Williams," Professor Marchand once addressed him in a seminar, "your arguments are very interesting, but you clearly have not fully grasped the concept." Michael realized that he hadn't been able to prepare properly because of the night shift. He had to apologize, but inwardly he felt he was letting himself down. Sleep deprivation became his constant companion. Sometimes he fell asleep in the library, and once he fell asleep in an exam, losing precious minutes. It was a signal that his body couldn't take it anymore. One evening on his way home from work, Michael received a call from his mother. Her voice was warm and supportive, as always. "Michael, I know this is hard for you," she said. "But remember, you've already done what none of us have ever done. You've already won." These words became a new source of inspiration for Michael. He realized that his struggle was not only for his own sake, but also for the sake of everyone who believed in him. Despite the challenges, Michael began to find ways to overcome obstacles. He became part of a research team working on an innovative financial analytics project. This gave him the opportunity to put his knowledge into practice and earn a little money. The project was successful, and Michael was invited to speak at a conference. His talk attracted interest, and Professor Marchand, who had criticized him before, publicly praised his work for the first time. "Mr. Williams, your perseverance is impressive," he said after the speech. "I'm glad you're not giving up." But the successes didn't make the path any easier. For every day he felt he was doing well, there were nights when he wondered, was it worth it? One day on his way home, he met his classmates on the street who were discussing vacation plans. "Where are you going, Michael?" one of them asked. Michael smiled embarrassedly. He didn't have time for vacations. Vacation meant more shifts at work and preparing for the next semester. "I'll stay here," he replied, trying not to show disappointment. Gradually, Michael began to feel that his efforts were paying off. His grades were improving, and his name was becoming recognizable in academia. He received an offer from one of his professors to participate in a major research project that could be his ticket to the world of big finance. Michael realized that despite all the difficulties, he was moving in the right direction. Each day brought him closer to his goal. Michael Williams' last semester at Harvard was a final marathon for him. Every day, every minute he invested in his studies, projects, and preparation for graduation. Obtaining a master's degree in economics with honors was not just a dream for him, but a symbol of perseverance that helped him overcome incredible challenges. But shortly after his triumph, Michael faced a harsh reality. Even his merit could not protect him from public prejudice. The last few months of school were intense. Final exams, group projects, and thesis preparation turned each week into a continuous battle against fatigue. Michael was writing his thesis on financial strategies to stimulate economic growth in depressed areas. "Is this something personal to you, Mr. Williams?" Professor Marchand asked, looking over the draft. "Yes, sir," Michael replied. "This is my life." Michael's work stood out from the rest. His research was based not only on theoretical data, but also on real stories from his childhood. He described how poor neighborhoods in Detroit could thrive if invested in wisely. When graduation day came, Michael felt adrenaline mixed with pride. He stood in the row of graduates, cap in hand. "Congratulations to Michael Williams, M.A. in economics," pronounced the dean of the faculty. Applause erupted in the audience, and Michael walked out onto the stage. His heart was pounding, and his eyes were filled with images of his mother, his sisters, and all the people who had supported him along the way. After the ceremony, he approached Professor Marchand. "Thank you for everything, sir," Michael said. "It is you who should be thanking yourself, Williams," replied the professor. "You have proved that persistence can overcome any obstacle." With his diploma in hand, Michael was ready to conquer the professional world. He sent resumes to leading financial companies that were known for their reputation. He felt that his achievements spoke for themselves. But the reality was different. The first wave of rejections took him by surprise. The companies politely thanked him for his interest, but informed him that they had found more suitable candidates. Maybe it was a lack of experience, Michael suggested, discussing it with a classmate. Maybe, he replied, but I find it strange that you can't even get an interview with those grades and references. The real shock for Michael was the first interview he was invited to. It was a large consulting company in New York. Michael arrived in advance, prepared answers to all possible questions, and gathered a portfolio of his projects. The interview began in a standardized way. The first questions were about his education and experience, but soon the tone changed. "Are you from Detroit?" the manager asked, taking a quick look at his resume. "Yes, sir." "It must be an interesting experience," he said, curling his lips slightly. "Harvard is certainly impressive, but you do realize that our company works with high-level clients?" This comment caused Michael a mixture of surprise and disappointment. He felt that he was being evaluated not for his knowledge, but for where he came from. After the interview, he was rejected. The reason? "We are looking for a candidate who better fits our corporate culture." Back home, Michael called his mother. "Mom, I feel like all my efforts have been in vain," he said, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Don't say that, Michael," Rebecca said. "You've been through so much and you're still standing in your own way. These people don't define your worth." Her words gave him the strength to carry on. Michael realized he had to change his approach. Instead of waiting for invitations, he decided to take action. He started working on his own startup, inspired by his graduate work. His idea was to create a platform that connected investors with projects in depressed neighborhoods. It was risky, but Michael knew that this was his chance not only to prove his worth, but also to change the world for the better. He started small. He found a few like-minded people among his classmates, attracted his first investor, and registered the company. "This is just the beginning," he said to himself as he looked at his company name on the computer screen. It had been several months since Michael had started working on his own startup. He still faced many challenges: lack of funding, uncertainty in the market, and constant questions about whether his idea would be in demand. But when he heard about a job opening at a large international consulting company, his heart was filled with hope. That afternoon, Michael sat at his laptop, checking his email. As usual, he received a lot of messages, but one of them caught his attention. The email said that a well-known consulting company had an opening for Harvard graduates with a master's degree. After reading the job description, Michael felt something inside him turn over. This job was perfect for him. Analytics, strategic planning, working with large clients who could develop projects in depressed neighborhoods. This was his opportunity to reach the next level. "Gotta give it a try," he said to himself. He began to prepare thoroughly. Michael knew that this chance was his last hope for a career in big companies, and he couldn't afford to fail. He updated his resume, sharpened his negotiation skills, and repeated all the material he had once studied at Harvard. Every moment was important, every detail worth its weight in gold. Before the interview, Michael met with one of his old classmates, John, who was already working at that company. John was a confident and experienced professional, but he had started at the bottom, just like Michael. "John, do you think I can pass the interview?" Michael asked, sensing the nervousness in his voice. "Michael, you're in the right place. You have everything you need. Most importantly, don't forget that you're not going in for a test, but to show them that you can make a difference. Your story and your experience is unique. They'll appreciate that," John said with a smile. Those words sustained Michael. He felt that maybe this job was exactly what he needed. The day of the interview came, and Michael woke up early to get ready. In the mirror, he saw himself, confident, but slightly worried. He carefully chose a suit that he thought was the perfect combination of austere and modern. On the way to the interview, he reread his resume and major accomplishments several times to be ready to answer any questions. As he entered the company's office, he felt the tension in the air increase. The glass walls, the modern interior, the stylish offices all gave him the feeling that his journey was just beginning. He was greeted in the lobby by a receptionist who escorted him to the interview room. When the door opened, Michael found himself in a room where three people were sitting: the HR director, the company's CFO, and another specialist whose name Michael didn't know. He exhaled and felt his heart beat faster, but immediately remembered John's words. He had come not only to show his qualifications, but also to prove to himself that he could be the best. "Good afternoon, Michael," said the Human Resources Director. "We are glad you took the time to come and see us." Michael nodded and sat down at the table, feeling his hands trembling slightly. He thought over every step and every word. He knew that in this interview he would be evaluated not only for his knowledge, but also for his ability to be confident despite everything he had been through. The interview began with the simplest of questions. They asked about his experience, what projects he had led at Harvard, and how he coped with difficulties. Michael answered confidently, emphasizing that it was in the most difficult situations that he showed his best qualities: teamwork, analytical thinking, and innovative approaches. When the conversation turned to his past, the HR director asked an unexpected question. "Michael, you mentioned that you are originally from Detroit. How do you think your experience living in that neighborhood has influenced your work in finance?" Michael felt the eyes of his companions fixed on him. It was a question that was not solely about his education, but about his personal experience. But instead of being nervous, he answered honestly, "My experience living in Detroit has shaped my understanding of the importance of seeing opportunities where others see only obstacles. There were many problems in my neighborhood, but in those problems, I learned to find solutions. It's not just an experience, it's a part of me. And that's what I want to bring to your company: the ability to see potential where others see only challenges." The interviewees were impressed by his answer. They exchanged glances and then continued asking questions, curious about his approach to solving complex financial problems. Michael felt his confidence growing by the minute. He felt he could handle this challenge. After the interview, Michael walked out of the building with a slight but still unsure feeling. He knew he had done his part. Everything now depended on whether they would see in him the very value he was trying to convey. "That was the best interview I've ever had," he said to himself, wiping a drop of sweat from his forehead. "Now we just have to wait." Over the next few days, Michael worried, but also felt that everything would be okay. Inwardly, he knew that regardless of the outcome, he had already done his best. And if this company didn't accept him, then he just hadn't yet met the opportunity that would be truly right for him. After the interview with the consulting company was over, Michael felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He knew that he had done his best, but he did not know that the next step awaited him: a confrontation with a corporate culture that, as it turned out, was not as tolerant as he had expected. The day Michael received an invitation to interview with the company's CEO, he was both excited and tense. It was the moment when his professional life could change. Mr. Walters, the company's CEO, was a man with an ironclad reputation for strictly enforcing corporate standards. Michael knew this interview was his chance. When he entered Mr. Walters' office, the first thing he noticed was the cold, almost isolated interior: white walls, expensive carpets, luxurious chairs and desk. It was just as he'd imagined it would be: corporate style, emphasized by official austerity. But as soon as he looked at Mr. Walters, he immediately sensed a certain tension in the atmosphere. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walters," Michael said, extending his hand. The CEO, a tall and well-groomed man in a suit, looked at him without smiling. "Greetings, Michael," he said in a cold voice. "Come in, sit down." Michael settled himself across from him, trying to remain confident. He knew that his knowledge and experience was something that should speak for him. "Tell me, Michael, what brought you to our company?" Mr. Walters asked, keeping his eyes on the table. Michael started talking about his experience at Harvard, his project on developing economies in depressed areas, and how his approaches could help companies develop new strategies for poor regions. "My experience in the most difficult conditions has taught me to find unconventional solutions," Michael said, feeling his every phrase becoming important. Despite Mr. Walters' polite questions and cold smiles, however, Michael sensed something odd about the atmosphere. He couldn't quite put his finger on what it was, but his intuition told him that he wasn't being given the level of respect he deserved. Mr. Walters seemed to retreat further and further into his world, asking questions that became more and more superficial. "Well, overall, Michael, your qualifications look good. But tell me, how will you work in a team with people like our high-end clients? I believe that in order to be successful, It is important to understand not only the professional requirements, but also the cultural sensitivities of different sections of society. Michael tried to emphasize that it is not only professionalism that is important, but also the ability to work with diverse groups. But the CEO only curled his lips slightly. Of course, but you do realize that we work with people who are used to a different level of communication, he said as if casually. Michael felt the tension building. He knew this wasn't just a question of professionalism, it was a moment when his experience and background were being questioned. As the interview drew to a close and Michael began to pack, he sensed that something was wrong. Mr. Walters told him, "We'll get back to you shortly. Michael, thank you for your time." Michael left the office with his hands in his pockets, feeling strangely relieved. His intuition told him that the decision had already been made. The next day, the official rejection came, polite but without any explanation. "We have decided to continue to look for a candidate who better fits our corporate culture," read the text of the letter. This was the moment when Michael realized his background, his skin color, and his roots in a poor neighborhood were more important to the company than his education or experience. He was too different to fit the perception of the classic corporate candidate. Michael sat in his small apartment looking at the rejection letter. He remembered how, as a child, when his father was dying, he had promised himself that he would achieve a better life. He had come a long way through years of hard study and work. He dreamed of a career, of stability, of becoming successful, but instead, he faced another wall he couldn't break down, a wall of racism disguised as corporate courtesy. It was all too bitter. It was a rejection not only of his professional aspirations, but of everything he thought possible. As a man who had gone through everything to prove his worth, he found himself in a trap that could not be avoided. But Michael wasn't ready to give up. Although the pain of rejection and disappointment chained him for a while, he knew he had to move on. He wasn't ready to let his dreams be shattered by someone else's bias. Michael realized that for people like him, every failure was just another stepping stone to success. "I'm not going to let this break me," he said to himself as he got up from his chair. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he was sure of one thing: he would keep fighting. And this rejection was just another test he had to pass. After receiving the rejection, Michael couldn't shake the feeling of inner emptiness that filled his heart. He sat in his small apartment in downtown Boston, staring at the wall in front of him. On that spot, on those 4 blank walls, centered all his life, all the pain, all the effort he had put into his studies and work. How could he fight for his dream for so many years if the world around him was only willing to judge him by the color of his skin? How could he explain to himself that years of study, sleepless nights of work, and sacrificing his personal life had not led him to the result he sought? He felt that his whole journey from childhood in Detroit to graduate school at Harvard was somehow absurd, meaningless. So much effort, so much sacrifice, and in the end, it all came down to one thing: he wasn't given a chance because he was black. Michael opened the letter from the company again and reread it. Each time his eyes stopped at the lines that said, "Looking for a candidate who better fits the company culture." He realized that it wasn't just a standard rejection. It was an excuse that hid the real reasons. "It's not true," he whispered through clenched teeth. "I'm coming up. I was ready. I deserve this." He got up from his chair and started pacing the room, feeling the anger and frustration fill his chest. But immediately his thoughts returned to what was happening to him. No matter how hard he tried, the world around him just wouldn't accept him. Michael remembered how he had been younger, how he had been burning with dreams of the future, of the possibility of changing his life. When he was in high school, he was full of optimism, wanting to find his place in the world. He dreamed that all his efforts would someday lead to success. And here he is, standing still, not knowing how to move forward. He remembered his mother, how she always told him that it was important to believe in himself, that he could become anything, that his skin color didn't determine his destiny. "You are not your skin color, Michael. You are your effort and your belief in yourself." But how long could he keep fighting if every new challenge reminded him that his place in this society was still on the margins? The days became hazy. Michael never left the apartment again. He didn't answer his phone, didn't read his letters. He fell into a state of apathy, consumed by thoughts that there was no point in continuing. Everything he'd taught himself at university, all his successes, everything was devalued. He couldn't bring himself to believe that his efforts had any meaning in this world where he was only seen as black. Everything he had done was not enough. The forgotten dreams that had once inspired him now seemed distant and empty. He felt like he was losing himself. That night he lay in the dark again, his thoughts heavy and restless. On the third day of loneliness, John, an old friend who had always supported him despite the difficulties he faced, came to his apartment. "Michael, have you lost your mind?" John asked, seeing his condition. "You can't just give up. You've traveled so far to be here. You know how much you have to give to this world." Michael looked at John with weariness in his eyes. He felt that this conversation was necessary, but he didn't know what to say. "You don't understand, John," he said quietly. "I did everything they told me to do. I studied, I worked hard, I suffered, and in the end they just said I didn't fit. Because I'm black. I'll never be good enough for them. I'm missing the point." John walked over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. "You're not missing the point, Michael. You're not. You paved this road for yourself. You've accomplished things that most people can't even imagine. You have to remember that it's not how you're judged by the outside world. It's how you see yourself. It's not the end. It's just another stage. You have to move on." Michael remained silent. John was right, but inwardly he couldn't accept it. It was hard, too hard for him. He didn't know how to get back on his feet after what he'd been through. However, despite his despair, there was a small spark in him. He knew he couldn't give up, even though he didn't understand how to move forward. Perhaps all he needed was time to sort himself out. Michael thought about what John had said. "You paved this road for yourself." He realized that despite all the rejections, all the humiliation and pain, he had always moved forward, no matter what. He couldn't let one setback or two, or even a dozen humiliations ruin everything he had built. He wasn't ready to give up. Maybe next time, he would not only fight for his dream, but also learn to be stronger and more determined than before. Time would not stop, and Michael knew he had to keep going. And so, with that thought in mind, he got up and walked outside for the first time in days. After several months of unsuccessful attempts to find a job in large companies, Michael began to lose hope. He increasingly realized that his dream of a prestigious career in a large firm was beginning to seem unattainable. His state of mind remained fragile, and each rejection only deepened his despair. But one day, while searching through job advertisements, Michael came across an offer from a small, little-known company. It was a far cry from the stately corporations he had once dreamed of working with. However, something about the ad caught his attention. It was not just a job with a good salary, but a chance to join a team that, despite its low profile, had ambitious goals. The company was looking for someone with his skills, with his approach to analyzing economic problems, and with an understanding of how to improve relationships within the organization. Michael hesitated for a long time. He knew that this job would not solve all his problems, that it would not give him the status he was looking for. But deep down, he realized that it was a chance to start somewhere, to start doing something useful despite all his previous failures. He sent in his resume and got an interview. When Michael arrived for his first day of work, he realized that his new job was not where he expected to be. The office was small with no fancy chairs or glass partitions like the big corporations. But there was something genuine about the way people worked here. Every employee knew his job and was passionate about it. Even if this place didn't give him the same level of fame and profit, Michael felt he had an opportunity to prove himself. There was no elitism or arrogance here. As in large companies, everyone worked equally, and despite his depression, Michael decided that this job was not the end, but the beginning of something important. He realized that he could use his knowledge and experience to improve not only his life, but also this company. Michael soon realized that his path to his new job was not going to be as easy as he thought. Even though the company was small, it had its own corporate culture that was not always accepting of the idea of change. But deep down, Michael knew he belonged here. He was willing to fight, to use his influence to create a more inclusive environment where every employee, regardless of color or social background, would have the opportunity for career advancement. His decision was clear. If he couldn't change the system from the outside, he would start from within. He had already experienced rejection, humiliation, and despair, but now he had a new goal: to create an environment where no one would be judged by the color of their skin, where everyone, regardless of their background, would have a chance to succeed. Michael's first step was to hold meetings with colleagues, paying attention to their needs and experiences. He helped new employees adapt to the team, defended those who faced injustice, and tried to create an atmosphere of trust and openness. He knew that his actions might not always be understood, but he realized that this was his chance to make a difference. One day during a regular meeting when an important project was being discussed, Michael noticed how one of his colleagues, Jason, gave too much attention to an idea proposed by another employee, a woman who Michael felt was underappreciated on the team. Jason didn't know what Michael had noticed, but the man, showing his persistence, tried to take the floor. "I think there are still a lot of ideas in our collective that are invisible to most people. I would like us to discuss how to give everyone a chance to speak up and make their suggestions valuable, no matter who they are or where they come from." It was only a small beginning, but for Michael it meant more than just a conversation about professionalism. He felt that little by little, step by step, he was beginning to change the atmosphere in the team. With each passing month, he felt the struggle, though imperceptible, bearing fruit. His ideas were becoming part of the corporate culture. He proposed several initiatives to improve cross-cultural communication and introduced a project to raise awareness of racial issues among employees. These were not grandiose projects, but rather steps that were, however, beginning to change the very atmosphere of the workplace. A colleague, Amanda, suggested a training on cultural inclusiveness, and Michael was her most vocal supporter. This was the moment when the company started to take these issues seriously. He saw things slowly change, and although these changes seemed small, he knew they meant much more than just the internal work of the team. Over time, Michael began to feel that this was his true calling. He looked for ways to use this experience to implement deeper changes in the company. He realized that the fight for equality doesn't end with one proposal or training. It is a process that requires daily effort, patience, and consistency. Every day at this new job was a step toward a bigger goal for Michael. He knew his place here was no accident, and although he couldn't change everything overnight, he was willing to keep working to ensure that in the corporate environment, all people, regardless of their appearance or background, had equal rights to success. He wasn't ready to give up, and although his dream of a large corporation was still in his head, he realized that the path to change doesn't start by looking for the perfect environment, but by taking action where you are. After a few months of working for a small company, Michael felt his life gradually changing. He was no longer the man who had once been mired in doubt and despair. He realized that despite all his failures and obstacles, he could still have an impact on the world around him, and that feeling inspired him to move on. One of the first steps was the decision to start sharing his thoughts with others. Michael knew that his experiences, his fight against racism, and his desire to make a difference in the corporate environment could benefit others. It wasn't just a desire to speak out, but a realization that his story could help others who were facing the same issues. He began to write. Michael opened his laptop and began with simple texts that described his experiences, his perspective on racism in the corporate world, and the importance of inclusivity. He wrote about how hard it was for him to find a job despite his Harvard degree and years of hard work. He shared how he felt when his efforts were nullified because of the color of his skin. At first, it was just notes he posted on his personal blog, but soon his articles began to attract attention. People started leaving comments, sharing their stories, and discussing the issues Michael was raising. He realized that his voice really did have power. He was no longer a loner silently fighting the system. Now his words were becoming part of the public dialogue. One day, a few months into his publications, Michael was invited to speak at a conference on inclusion and diversity in the workplace. It was a huge opportunity, a chance not only to share his experiences, but also to highlight the challenges faced by many people struggling with bias. When the day of the speech came, Michael felt nervous. It was his first public appearance on such an important topic. But when he got on stage and looked at the people in the audience, he realized that this was a moment worth going through everything he had been through. Michael began with a personal story. He talked about his childhood in Detroit, his struggle with poverty, the death of his father, and how he single-handedly pursued his goals. He talked about the racism he faced throughout his career and how they tried to exclude him from society just because of his skin color. But instead of complaining, he talked about how these trials toughened him up and taught him to fight and not give up. I tell this story, Michael said at the end, to show that skin color should not define who we are or what we are capable of. We all deserve equal opportunity, and each of us must fight to make this world a fairer place. I was one of those people who was tried to be broken, but I found the strength to keep going, and each of you can do the same. The applause that followed his speech was a sign to Michael that his words really resonated. There were many people in the audience who had also experienced similar difficulties, and they now saw him as a symbol that change was possible. After the conference, Michael began receiving invitations to other events where he could share his thoughts. He began writing more in-depth articles and research on racial disparities in the professional world. His work was increasingly quoted in various publications and journals, and each month his name became better known. In his text, Michael wrote not only about personal experiences, but also about systemic problems that are deeply rooted in society. He talked about the importance of not just talking about equality, but actually basically implementing inclusive practices in every organization. He shared his observations on how companies often pretend to work on diversity, but in reality, nothing changes, and how it's important to prioritize empowering those who were previously excluded to not only speak up, but to make decisions. Michael became active in connecting with others who faced similar challenges. He became part of a community of activists working to eliminate racial disparities in the workplace. He held roundtables, participated in panel discussions, and his influence grew every day. He saw the importance of working together, joining forces to create a more just society. One day, Michael received a letter that shook him to the core. It was from a young woman who said that after reading one of his articles, she had decided to fight for her rights in the workplace. She told him how she had long endured injustice and racism in her company, but now, inspired by his words, she had decided to ask her management to change the working conditions for people who face discrimination. This letter was a powerful reminder to Michael that even one person willing to share their experience can impact the lives of others. He realized that his work was just beginning. With each new message, with each new letter, he became more and more confident that his struggle had meaning. Michael soon realized that he had become not only a voice for change, but an active participant in the very change he wanted to see in the world. He was no longer someone who despaired after rejections. He became part of an important movement for equality and justice. Michael knew that there was still a long way to go, that the problems he faced would not disappear overnight. But now he was ready for that journey. He knew that the fight for equality was not only a personal victory, but a victory for the whole community. And although his dream of a great career in a prestigious company was still in his heart, he now realized that the most important thing is the ability to change society as a whole, not just to become part of one corporation. Michael sat on the veranda of his house, absorbed in his thoughts. Outside the window was the evening city, neon lights, silence broken only by the noise of the street. He often loved such moments when he could stop, exhale, and look back. How many things had come his way? From that obscure childhood in a poor Detroit neighborhood to a Harvard degree, from a small job at a company to the moment when his voice began to be heard by the world. Michael had experienced so much over the years that at times he felt as if he had traveled through several lives. But he couldn't forget that despite all his accomplishments, his struggle wasn't over. Today he was again at a meeting to which he was invited as an expert. He talked about racial discrimination in business, how important it is to create an inclusive corporate culture, and how working as equals means giving everyone the same opportunities for growth. He saw people in the audience nodding excitedly, realizing that the topic was important. But despite everything, Michael knew that this was only the first step, and there was still a long way to go. Michael thought deeply. He realized that the fight for equality was a marathon, not a sprint. Sometimes he felt that change was happening too slowly. He faced the same barriers as before, and sometimes it even felt like the world was taking 2 steps forward and then 1 back. He saw some companies pretending to work on diversity while others continued to stay in the shadows without changing anything. He knew that success doesn't come overnight, that every small victory, every person who changes their attitude is a step forward. But those steps have to be taken all the time. And even when everything seems hopeless, you have to keep fighting. Michael often told himself that if he had given up after the first rejection, the second, the 10th, there would be no job, no people with whom he now shared his knowledge, no change. He could have just gone into the shadows like so many others and hidden his success. But he knew that his journey was not just a personal achievement, but part of something much bigger. Today was a turning point for Michael. He couldn't believe that everything he had experienced had at some point become something that could inspire others. His articles continued to appear in the most prominent publications. He was invited on television and was a frequent guest at conferences. But most importantly, he began to see people around him in many cities and countries begin to move forward. Michael became part of a network of people who genuinely wanted to see the world a fairer place. He began working with young activists, supporting those who faced challenges along the way. But despite all of this, he knew the work was not yet complete. Each day brought new challenges, new battles, and no matter what happened, he had to keep fighting. He thought of those who had been by his side, supporting him every step of the way. People who helped him not to lose faith in himself in difficult moments. About colleagues who had become his friends and those who, despite their prejudiced views, had later changed. It was a huge job that required patience and perseverance. Michael knew his story was not unique. Thousands of people like him faced the same problems. He wasn't a hero, he was just a man who refused to give up. He realized that his voice could inspire others and give them the strength to fight, even when things seemed impossible. And that was his greatest achievement. He always said, "We shouldn't be afraid to be who we are. We shouldn't be afraid to go against the tide." And that became his credo. He didn't know what steps were ahead of him in the future, but he knew that he would keep moving forward. For him, there was no such thing as too late or too hard. He was a living example that change is possible if you don't give up. Michael often recalled his first steps when he faced rejection and despair and didn't know what to do next. Back then, in his loneliness, he could not have imagined that his story would inspire others. But now, looking back, he saw that every step, every action, every word he spoke mattered. He realized that change does not happen overnight. He realized that the struggle for equality was a long journey that required patience, effort, and determination. It was not the struggle of one person, but the struggle of an entire society. Each step towards justice and equality was a small victory that would eventually lead to a big change. Michael knew that his journey was just beginning. Although he still had many challenges and obstacles ahead of him, he was ready to keep going. His story was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey that he had traveled and was now ready to walk with those who were ready to fight for a better future. He stood up from the veranda, lifted his head, and looked out at the city, which was living its own life, unaware of his thoughts. But Michael knew one thing: his struggle was not in vain. He would keep fighting, keep talking, and keep changing the world. And someday, maybe his children and his children's children will live in a world where no one will be judged by the color of their skin, where people can just be themselves without fear that their fate will be predetermined by their background. Michael sighed, clenching his fists. This was only the first step, and there was more work to be done, and he was ready. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.